What if the strangest objects in our museums and archives aren't answers at all, but questions that refuse to stay buried? Picture a locked drawer inside a government warehouse, or a foam-lined case in a quiet university lab where the lights are always a little too bright. Inside, something small and solid waits without moving, without speaking. Yet it changes the way a room feels. Not because it proves anything, because it suggests that our story of progress, how humans learned, built, and climbed from stone to silicon, might be less like a straight road and more like a coastline, full of coves, hidden inlets, places the map forgot to label. We like history tidy, we like timelines that behave. We want inventions to arrive in order, like chapters in a textbook. Fire, wheel, writing, electricity, computers. It's comforting. It implies that we understand ourselves, and that the past is a solved problem. But every so often, an object appears that seems to misfile itself in time, a fragment of metal that shouldn't bend the way it does, a mechanism that suggests a mind thinking in gears and mathematics centuries before we think it's possible, a carved crystal so precise it feels less like art and more like engineering, a lump of alloy where the chemistry reads like a note written in a dialect metallurgy didn't speak yet, a spiral form too perfect to be an accident, sealed inside stone that insists it is unimaginably old. Most of these stories arrive the same way, in rumors, in field reports, in reluctant interviews, in the margins of archaeological catalogues. Some are exaggerated, some are misunderstood, some are simply wrong. That's the nature of mystery. People fill the gaps with whatever they already believe, and yet the persistence is hard to ignore. The recurring pattern is what makes it unsettling. The claim that certain artifacts are studied quietly, moved quickly, categorized vaguely, and then, if not erased, softened into something more acceptable. A curiosity, a hoax, a misdated sample, a likely this or probably that, because the alternative is heavier. The alternative is that our understanding of human capability is incomplete, not just in degree, but in shape, that there may be detours in the history of knowledge, bursts of brilliance that rose and vanished, techniques discovered and lost, or at the far edge of speculation, encounters that would force us to widen the circle of who counts as a maker. This series is not a courtroom argument. It isn't a promise of revelation, and it isn't a hunt for villains. It's a guided walk through a gallery of anomalies, 10 stories that hover between science and folklore, between what can be tested and what can only be told. We'll treat each claim with respect, but not reverence. We'll separate what is known from what is suggested. We'll admit uncertainty when it belongs there. Because the deeper theme isn't, are we alone? Not in the simplistic way. The deeper theme is how humans respond when reality doesn't match our expectations, what we do with uncomfortable evidence, how institutions manage ambiguity, how wonder can be both a compass and a trap. In every era, people have met the unknown with two impulses, the urge to explain and the urge to protect. One builds laboratories, the other builds locked doors. Sometimes both impulses live in the same person. If you've ever held an old photograph and felt that strange flicker, how a moment can outlive a lifetime, then you already understand the emotional core of this journey. Objects are memory made physical. They outlast us, and occasionally they contradict us. So we begin with a simple question. When an artifact doesn't fit the story we tell about ourselves, do we revise the story, or do we hide the artifact? Tonight, we open the first case, not to prove a conclusion, but to listen carefully to what the evidence, real, rumored, or misunderstood, might be trying to say about time, invention, and the fragile confidence of human history. What if the first artifact in this story wasn't an ancient relic at all, but a whisper from the modern desert wrapped in aluminum gray silence? It begins in New Mexico, where the land looks empty until you spend enough time with it. Then you realize it's crowded with small details: thorn shadows, insect trails, wind writing its own cursive across the sand. In July of 1947, that wind carried something else, an event so quickly narrated and re-narrated that it became a mirror. People looked into it and saw what they feared, what they hoped, what they were willing to believe. A rancher finds debris. The military arrives. Statements are made, corrected, replaced. A simple story is offered: weather balloon. And yet, in the years that follow, another story grows in the spaces between the official lines, one that insists the material recovered didn't behave like anything ordinary. The phrase that clings to this legend is memory metal. The idea is seductive: a thin, crumpled sheet that refuses to stay crumpled, smoothing itself as if it remembers what it used to be. Not alive, not moving with intent, just refusing to be permanently changed by human hands. A material that treats our strongest tools like mild suggestions. It's the kind of detail that feels made for late-night radio, for half-lit living rooms, for minds that don't want the universe to be small. But it's also the kind of detail that makes engineers lean forward. Because even without aliens, the notion of a metal that returns to a predefined shape has a real scientific vocabulary. We know about alloys that do this, materials that, under certain conditions, can snap back into form. We know about breakthroughs that start as curiosities and end as whole industries. So the tension arrives right here. Is the memory metal story simply a folk translation of something misunderstood? Or is it an early brush with technology ahead of its time, human or otherwise, that slipped briefly into public view? In the decades after Roswell, the crash itself becomes less important than the emotional equation it represents. It lands at the dawn of the Cold War, when secrecy becomes a language spoken fluently by institutions, when skies fill with experimental aircraft and surveillance projects, when the public is told again and again that certain things are for your own good to not know. Under that kind of pressure, myth grows like a living organism. Every withheld detail becomes oxygen. Every correction becomes proof of a cover story. A community is formed around the belief that the real evidence is locked away, studied quietly, and never allowed to disturb the official narrative. And maybe some of it is locked away, though not for cosmic reasons. In a world obsessed with strategic advantage, unusual materials would be treated like a national resource, no matter where they came from. That doesn't require extraterrestrials. It only requires the logic of power. Still, there's a human element that keeps returning in this story. Witnesses who describe not just debris, but a feeling. The odd calm of men who won't meet your eyes. The speed with which a place becomes restricted. The way an incident is swallowed by paperwork and authority until it feels like it never happened at all. This is what makes the Roswell material story durable. Not the certainty of proof, but the shape of the experience. A sudden rupture, a quick explanation, a long, lingering doubt. If you listen closely, Roswell isn't only about what fell from the sky. It's about what happens when an object, real or rumored, stresses the seams of trust between a public and the institutions that manage reality on its behalf. And so we end with the question that matters more than the metal itself. When people feel the truth is being handled without them, do they become more careful thinkers, or do they become hunger itself, consuming any story that promises to fill the void? In the next chapter, we move from desert debris to something stranger, a piece of engineering that seems to belong in the modern mind, yet appears to have been born centuries too early. An object that doesn't ask, "Are we alone?" so much as it asks, "How well do we really know our own past?" What if the most unnerving evidence of advanced knowledge isn't hidden in a military vault, but displayed behind glass, labeled like a souvenir from antiquity? Imagine standing in a museum, where the air is cool and the lighting is polite. You drift past marble faces with blank, dignified eyes. You pause at pottery that still carries fingerprints from hands dead for 2,000 years. And then you see it, a corroded cluster of bronze and gears, the size of a small suitcase recovered from the sea. It looks like a mistake. At first glance, it's a lump, something you might ignore if it weren't for the careful way it's mounted, the quiet reverence of the display. But if you lean in, the story sharpens. Tooth-like gear edges, circular scales, fragments of inscriptions. A machine, an instrument, born in an era we picture as candles and oars, not precision engineering. This is where the past begins to feel unsteady beneath your feet. The legend of impossible devices often turns on a single question. Could people long ago do far more than we credit them for? Not in the romantic way, as if ancient cultures were magical, but in the practical way, through observation, mathematics, craft, and patience. The sea is a brutal curator. It eats wood and paper. It rusts iron into silence. But sometimes it preserves what we least expect, sealing evidence inside wrecks like time capsules. When divers brought this gearwork up from a shipwreck, they didn't rescue a myth. They rescued a problem, a mechanism that seemed to model the sky. The idea is simple and enormous at once, a device capable of predicting or tracking celestial cycles. In modern terms, a kind of analog computer, not with screens or electricity, but with ratios and rotations, with time turned into motion. The first reaction to such finds is often disbelief, followed by a frantic search for a simpler explanation. Maybe it's decorative. Maybe it's not what it seems. Maybe it was misdated or misinterpreted. We reach for loopholes because the alternative feels like a rebuke, an accusation that we've been looking down on our ancestors through a fog of arrogance. But the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to dismiss. Precision, intent, complexity that suggests an entire tradition of knowledge behind it, even if the rest of that tradition didn't survive. This is the first major pivot in our journey, because unlike desert rumors or classified scraps, this kind of artifact forces a different kind of humility. It doesn't demand we invoke visitors from the stars. It demands we confront a quieter possibility, that human brilliance is not a straight upward line. It flares, it dims, it migrates. It is lost in wars, fires, political collapse, and simple neglect. We speak of the ancient world as if it were a single mind. It wasn't. It was thousands of minds, arguing in marketplaces, teaching apprentices, sketching in dust, staring at planets with nothing but their eyes and a fierce desire to understand. And yet, if devices like this existed, why aren't there more? Why don't we find workshops filled with gears? Why don't we uncover libraries that describe their design? That question is the crack where mystery gets in. Sometimes the answer is boring and tragic. Survival bias. Organic materials disappear. Precious metals are recycled. Great discoveries are hoarded by elites and then destroyed when those elites fall. The past is not designed to keep records for us. The past is designed to be lived through. But sometimes the question hints at something else, that certain knowledge may have been deliberately restricted, not in a melodramatic sense, but in the ordinary way power behaves. Tools that predict seasons and eclipses are tools that predict futures. And whoever controls prediction controls trust. The artifact, then, becomes more than a machine. It becomes a lens. It lets us see that history is full of quiet revolutions that didn't make it into the standard story because they didn't become widespread, or because they didn't survive the violence of time. If we accept that, even for a moment, then the idea of out-of-place artifacts changes shape. Some may be hoaxes, some may be mistakes, but some might be genuine proofs of knowledge that rose earlier than we expected, flickered briefly, and then slipped back into darkness. So here is the reflection to carry forward. What if the most radical thing an artifact can do is not prove we were visited, but remind us that humans have always been capable of astonishing thought, and that our ignorance of the past is not evidence of its simplicity? In the next chapter, we move from gears and astronomy to something more intimate, an object carved with such precision it feels like a message left in stone. Not, "Look what we built," but "Look how carefully we could imagine." What if an object can be both beautiful and suspicious at the same time, like a jewel that refuses to sit still inside the category we want to place it in? In a dim corner of a museum, a human skull stares back without eyes. It's clear as frozen water, carved from crystal, catching light the way ice catches moonrise. Visitors lean in. Their reflections bend across its cheekbones. The room quiets, not because anyone believes it's alive, but because something about it feels too deliberate, too exact, to belong to the story printed on the plaque. This is the world of the crystal skulls. The rumor surrounding them is always the same, even when the details change, that they are ancient, that they came from lost civilizations, that they contain knowledge, that they are artifacts not merely made but engineered, perhaps by hands guided from somewhere beyond our own lineage. It's an alluring narrative. Humans have always loved the idea that wisdom can be stored in an object, that if we touch the right relic, we might be granted access to forgotten truths. The skull, as a symbol, intensifies that longing. It is the shape we all carry beneath our faces. It is mortality rendered into geometry. But as soon as you step closer, the story becomes less about extraterrestrials and more about a harder, more uncomfortable theme: authenticity, provenance, the messy human hunger that makes forgeries flourish. Many crystal skulls surfaced in the modern era, often without clear archaeological context. They appeared in collections, auctions, and private hands, bearing stories as ornate as their craftsmanship. And when experts began to examine them, really examine them, questions multiplied. What kind of tool marks do they carry? Do those marks match the kinds of tools available to the cultures they're attributed to? Is the crystal local to the region, or does it point to trade routes or to something else entirely? Are the abrasions consistent with ancient methods, or do they resemble modern grinding? These questions are not romantic, they are clinical. They strip away the candlelight atmosphere and replace it with microscopes and lab notes. And yet that's where the real drama lives, not in declaring an object magical, but in watching the careful process of determining what it is. Because here is the twist. Even if a crystal skull turns out to be a modern fabrication, it still tells a powerful story. Not about aliens, about us. It becomes evidence of our susceptibility to wonder. proof that we sometimes prefer a thrilling origin over a boring truth, that we will build myths around objects because the myths soothe an ache to feel connected to something larger and older than our own brief lives. But there's another possibility that hangs in the air, quieter and more interesting than either ancient treasure or modern hoax. What if some of these objects are modern, but based on older traditions now partially lost? What if they sit in a gray zone, where the maker is real, the skill is extraordinary, and the cultural story is an evolving collage? In that light, the skull becomes less of a verdict and more of a question about how knowledge and craftsmanship travel. Artifacts don't only move through time, they move through desire. Collectors want certain things to be true. Museums want narratives that bring visitors. Communities want legacies that cannot be dismissed. And in the middle of all that wanting, objects are made, altered, reinterpreted, and sometimes relabeled until they become something new. The crystal skull, then, is a mirror. It reflects our faces back at us and asks, what do we do when the boundary between discovery and invention blurs? If a museum display can be shaped by storytelling as much as by evidence, where does that leave the listener? Where does it leave the citizen, trying to build a relationship with truth in a world full of curated narratives? And that brings us to a deeper layer of this series. Forbidden artifacts are not only forbidden because governments hide them. Sometimes they are forbidden because they expose the fragile machinery of belief, how easily we can be led by aesthetics, by symbolism, by the ache to be part of something extraordinary. So here's the question to hold as we move forward. When an object captures our imagination so completely, can we still treat it honestly? Or does the longing to believe become a tool that reshapes the evidence until it fits the story we already want? Next, we leave the glitter of crystal and enter something more grounded. An invention so simple it feels almost mundane, yet it carries a startling implication that certain kinds of science might have been practiced long before we're comfortable admitting it. What if the oldest technology wasn't a grand machine at all, but a small, corroded object that fits in the palm of your hand like something forgotten in a drawer? In the deserts of the Middle East, where wind sifts sand the way fingers sift flour, archaeologists have sometimes found the past in fragments: pottery, coins, bits of metal. Most of these pieces tell familiar stories: trade, daily life, the slow rhythm of civilizations. But one set of finds has lived for decades in a strange limbo between curiosity and controversy: clay jars containing copper, iron, and traces of something that looks suspiciously like deliberate assembly. The claim is almost too simple to be dramatic, that these jars could function as primitive batteries. The idea unsettles because it suggests a kind of practical electrical knowledge, something we tend to place firmly in the modern world. We picture ancient peoples as brilliant in architecture and astronomy, but we hesitate at the thought of them experimenting with chemical reactions in ways that produce current. Not because it's impossible, but because it scrambles the neat hierarchy we've built. Ancient equals symbolic, modern equals scientific. Here's how the story usually unfolds: a jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, sealing materials. Put an acidic liquid inside: vinegar, lemon juice, fermented wine, and, in theory, you could produce a small voltage, enough to tingle, enough to plate a thin film of metal, enough, at least, to make a curious person say, "Wait, what is this for?" And that question is everything. Because the moment you say battery, you imply intention, you imply knowledge, you imply a use case, Electroplating jewelry, maybe, or some kind of ritual effect, or an experimental tradition whose written record didn't survive. But critics counter with equally plausible explanations. These objects could be simple containers used for storing scrolls or sacred items. The metal pieces could be supports or remnants of a completely different purpose. A battery is a battery only if someone used it that way, and archaeology is full of objects that can be forced into modern categories if we squint hard enough. So the tension deepens. Not just, did it make electricity, but what counts as evidence of scientific intent? If you set up a reproduction and it produces current, that's intriguing. But it's not a time machine. It doesn't prove ancient technicians were running circuits. It proves only that the materials can behave in that way. The leap from possibility to historical reality requires context, workshops, residues, inscriptions, repeated patterns, related artifacts. Still, the story refuses to die because it contains a certain kind of truth, even if the battery interpretation is wrong. Ancient people were not passive. They experimented, they pushed materials, they discovered effects, and then incorporated them into craft, medicine, or ritual. Technology, in its earliest form, was not an industrial pipeline. It was curiosity with calloused hands. And there's something else hidden here. Our instinct to separate science from magic. In many old cultures, the boundary wasn't fixed. A strange effect, like a mild electric shock, might be interpreted spiritually and practically at the same time. A craftsman might learn that a certain combination of metals and liquids produces a reaction, and he might use that knowledge without ever writing the word electricity, without ever separating it from belief, which raises a delicate possibility. Even if ancient batteries existed, they might not have been treated as technology in the modern sense. They might have been treated as a secret of the workshop, a trick of the temple, a controlled phenomenon, wrapped in story, so it could be transmitted without fully understood. That's how knowledge sometimes survives, not through equations, but through ritual. So the artifact becomes a question about how we read the past. Do we demand that ancient peoples speak our language of science before we credit them with scientific behavior? Or can we accept that knowledge can be present in practice even when the theory isn't formalized? There's also a more human layer. When we find something that could be a battery, our minds light up because we're hungry for continuity. We want to believe our ancestors were closer to us than we think, that their minds reached toward the same mysteries, that our modern world is not a miracle, but a long, uneven inheritance. And yet, we must resist turning that hunger into certainty. The honest stance is not, it proves everything, or it proves nothing. The honest stance is, it suggests possibilities and it invites deeper work. So we end this chapter with a quiet, practical question. If the past contains experiments that look like science, but are wrapped in contexts we can't fully reconstruct, how many other discoveries have we misread simply because they don't arrive wearing modern labels? Next, we follow that thread into stone, into claims of impossible precision and markings that feel like messages from an engineer rather than an artist, carved in places where time should have erased the ambition long ago. What if the most unsettling artifact isn't something you can lift into a lab, but something too heavy to move, too large to ignore, and too stubborn to explain away with a single sentence? At dawn, stone behaves like memory. It holds cold in its pores. It drinks light slowly, and when you stand before ancient blocks, fitted so tightly that even a blade of grass can't find a seam, your modern confidence falters, not because you think it must be impossible, but because you realize how shallow your assumptions have been. In places like the high plateau of the Andes, the limestone terraces of the Levant, and the hard granite chambers of Egypt, there are stones that feel overachieved. Not just large, not just old, but finished with a kind of precision that makes the eye search for the tool that did it. The stories that circulate around these sites often leap too quickly. They skip the sweat, the scaffolds, the slow accumulation of skill. They jump to visitors from elsewhere because aliens is a short word that pretends to solve a long problem. But the real mystery is more human, and in some ways more moving. Consider the question of fit. When stones lock together in complex polygons, when their faces meet with a precision that seems to resist weather and time, what you're seeing is not magic. You're seeing planning, measurement, iteration, a culture investing labor into a result that will outlast everyone who touches it. That alone is a kind of audacity. Then consider the question of surface. At certain sites, you find marks that look to modern eyes like machining, flat planes, consistent grooves, right angles that feel too perfect for hand tools. The temptation is to treat the eye as a ruler and declare, this must be advanced technology. But eyes are unreliable instruments. Stone fractures can mimic tool paths. Erosion can exaggerate straightness. Later restorations can introduce modern cuts into ancient contexts. And yet, sometimes, even after you account for all that, the craftsmanship remains astonishing. Which leads us to a more grounded set of possibilities. One is that we underestimate what skilled teams can do with simple tools when they have time, organization, and a tradition of apprenticeship. Copper and stone abrasives, sand as a cutting agent, repeated scoring and polishing, water and patience. Even today, if you take a craftsperson seriously, they can make you question what you thought was possible. Another possibility is that ancient engineers had techniques that were locally known, widely practiced, and then lost, not because they were supernatural, but because civilizations break. Knowledge doesn't merely advance, it also dissolves. Wars, plagues, economic collapse, and shifting power can turn expertise into orphaned secrets. And there is a third possibility. Quieter, but important, we may be viewing different eras as one. Many ancient sites were built, modified, repaired, and repurposed over centuries. A foundation might be older than the temple above it. A wall might contain stones reused from earlier structures. The result can look like a single project when it is actually a layered conversation across time. This is where the term forbidden artifact becomes less literal and more symbolic. The stones aren't locked away. Anyone can visit. What feels forbidden is the implication that our mental model of the past is too narrow, that we have simplified ancient people into stereotypes, noble but primitive, artistic but not technical. Standing before certain megaliths, that stereotype breaks. You begin to imagine the human scenes that rarely make it into tourist brochures, surveyors pacing with cords and weights, teams shouting in rhythm as they haul, foremen arguing over tolerances, a young apprentice learning to read stone the way a musician reads sound, the pride of making something that declares, without words, we were here, and we knew what we were doing. And still the mystery remains, because some stones do carry a stubborn question. Why this level of effort? Why shape and place blocks so precisely when rougher work would hold? The answer might be structural, it might be ceremonial, it might be political, monuments as proof of legitimacy, or it might be psychological. Humans, given the chance, often build beyond necessity simply to prove that they can. So here is the reflection that closes this chapter. When we encounter ancient precision, do we rush to explain it with extraordinary outsiders, or do we let it restore dignity to ordinary human genius, even when that genius outpaces our expectations? Next, we turn from stone that endures to something that shouldn't, traces embedded in rock, claims of objects sealed inside deep time, as if the earth itself has been hiding a secret in its layers. What if the strangest artifacts aren't relics left by people, but intrusions left by time itself, like a sentence written in the wrong chapter of a book? There's a particular kind of story that always catches fire. Someone splits open a rock, sometimes in a quarry, sometimes on a work site, sometimes in a private collection, and finds something inside that seems manufactured. A metal shape, a threaded form, a delicate spiral, an object that looks like it belongs on a workbench, not entombed in stone. These are the out-of-place objects, the claims that suggest technology embedded in layers that, according to geology, should be far older than any human tool-making. And the emotional impact is immediate, because if such a claim were true in the strongest sense, if a modern-looking object were genuinely sealed in ancient rock, then the implications would radiate outward like shockwaves. It would mean either our understanding of Earth's timeline is wrong, or that intelligent toolmakers existed far earlier than we believe, or that objects can travel through time, or that our planet has hosted more stories than we've dared to imagine. That's why these tales spread. They offer a shortcut to wonder, but they also demand caution, because they live at the intersection of two difficult things: deep time and human error. Rocks can deceive. Concretions form around objects in surprisingly short periods under certain conditions, creating stony casings that look ancient. Minerals can precipitate, cementing debris into hard nodules. Sediments can trap modern materials and harden in ways that confuse the eye. And then there is the ordinary chaos of context. An object found in a rock might have been in a crack, in a cavity, in a layer disturbed by water, roots, or excavation. The problem is not that people lie. Sometimes they do, but more often, people misunderstand what they've found. The human mind is a pattern machine, and when it meets something uncanny, it completes the story for us. Still, there are cases that remain stubbornly compelling, at least at first pass. A metal form that resembles a plug or a component, a spiral like a miniature spring, the kind of shape that makes you feel, briefly, like you've brushed the edge of an impossible truth. So how do we approach such claims without becoming cynical or credulous? We begin with the unglamorous questions. Who found it? Where exactly was it found? Is the location documented? Are there photographs of the object in situ before removal? Has it been examined independently? What is its composition? Do the materials match modern industrial alloys or something more ambiguous? Are there tool marks? Is there evidence of corrosion patterns consistent with age or consistent with more recent exposure? Most out-of-place objects collapse under this pressure, not because a conspiracy crushes them, but because the chain of evidence is thin. A story without documentation is not proof. It's a campfire tale. And yet, the fact that many collapse doesn't erase the deeper fascination. Because even a false case teaches us something about what we're hungry for. We are hungry for interruption. We live in a world of constant change, but we still cling to the idea that reality is stable and ordered. An out-of-place object is like a glitch in the matrix, a reminder that our categories are not the world itself. They are maps, and maps no matter how carefully drawn, have blank spaces. There's also a more philosophical point. History is not only what happened, it is what survives. It is what gets recorded, preserved, and interpreted. If an object truly did end up in an impossible context, whether by accident, fraud, or some strange process, we would still need a human story to explain it. The artifact alone wouldn't speak. We would speak for it. And that's where our responsibility lies. Not to inflate a mystery into certainty, but to hold it gently, to keep the questions clean. Because the worst outcome isn't that we dismiss the weird. The worst outcome is that we use the weird as a license to abandon rigor. Wonder and discipline are not enemies. They are partners. Wonder asks the question. Discipline keeps the question honest. So we close with this reflection. When we encounter an apparent anomaly in deep time, do we treat it as a doorway to knowledge or as a stage for our imagination? And is it possible that the most important lesson isn't whether the object is truly ancient, but how quickly we rush to turn uncertainty into a story? Next, we follow a different kind of trace, one that doesn't pretend to be a manufactured object, but looks like a map carved into the world itself. Lines, figures, and symbols that can only be fully seen from above, as if designed for eyes that can fly. What if some of the most famous messages on Earth were never meant for someone standing on the ground? In the arid landscapes of southern Peru, the desert is so dry it behaves like a vault. Rain rarely visits. Wind moves carefully. And because of that, certain marks, scraped into the surface by hands long gone, can persist for centuries like drawings on skin that never heals. From the air, the ground becomes a canvas. Lines extend across the plain in deliberate paths, some arrow straight, some forming trapezoids and strange runways. Then come the figures. A hummingbird suspended in motion, a spider with limbs spread like a diagram, a monkey with a tail curled into a question mark. They are huge, so huge that from the ground they almost vanish, becoming only fragments of curve and angle. These are the geoglyphs we associate with the Nazca. The forbidden version of the story argues that these figures must be signs for visitors from the sky, that their scale implies aerial intelligence, that their creators were either guided by outsiders or were themselves responding to something they believed lived above them. The images seem to invite that interpretation because they feel like a language written for altitude. But there's another possibility, one that doesn't require extraterrestrials and still leaves us with awe, that humans have always been capable of building for perspectives they cannot physically inhabit if they can imagine them. Consider what it takes to draw something large and coherent. You need planning, you need measurement, you need reference points, you need a method for scaling shapes. None of this requires flight. It requires geometry and coordination. It requires a society that can hold an idea steady across time and labor. The deeper question is not, how did they do it, but why did they do it? Because the Nazca lines don't offer a single clear purpose. They are not easily reduced to one function. Some may have been ceremonial paths, processional routes walked by people during rituals, the act of walking turning the desert into a kind of sacred instrument. Some may align with celestial events or water sources. Some may have been part of a symbolic conversation with the landscape itself, a way of addressing gods, ancestors, or forces of nature that were believed to look down. In many cultures, the sky is not just space, it is a witness. And that concept, being seen from above, can shape behavior even when no human can see the full design. The value isn't always in human appreciation. Sometimes the value is in the offering. The effort is the prayer. Still, the aerial quality is hard to dismiss emotionally. When you see photographs, you feel a strange intimacy with the people who made them. You realize they were thinking on scales that exceed individual life. They were willing to scrape away the top layer of desert, stone by stone, line by line, until the earth itself carried their intentions. This is where the narrative becomes less about aliens and more about communication. Humans constantly reach outward, to gods, to future generations, to the unknown. The desert drawings become a form of reaching, a physical declaration that says, "We are here, we are listening, we are trying to be understood." There's also a haunting irony. We, modern humans, only truly understand the art because we can fly. We became the eyes that make the images legible, not because the ancient builders needed us, but because time delivered their work to a world with planes and satellites. Their audience changed. That shift in audience fuels the mythology. We look at the lines and assume they were made for us, or for beings like us, flying, hovering, watching from above. But the past rarely makes things for a single audience. It makes things for faith, for society, for memory. And those meanings evolve as new viewers arrive. So the Nazca lines sit at a crossroads. They can be framed as proof of outside influence, or they can be framed as proof of inside imagination, humans dreaming beyond their physical limits. The first story is thrilling. The second story is, in its own way, more intimate. It suggests that long before we had machines to lift us, we already had minds that could, and yet a question remains. If the lines were part of ritual life, why these specific animals? Why these forms? Why this scale? Why carve a spider large enough to be seen by the sky? Sometimes a symbol is a symbol because it is familiar. Sometimes it is a symbol because it is rare. Sometimes it is a symbol because it carries a story that didn't survive. So we end with this reflection. When we encounter art designed for a perspective beyond the human body, does that indicate outside intervention? Or does it reveal something deeply human? The ability to imagine a viewpoint we cannot yet reach. Next, we move from drawings on Earth to something that looks like writing. Claims of languages not recognized, inscriptions that resist translation, and artifacts that seem to carry a message no one can confidently read. What if the most disturbing evidence isn't a machine or a monument, but a message we can't interpret, like a voice speaking in a room where no one shares its language? There are inscriptions that sit comfortably in our museums. We can read them. We can place them. We can trace their alphabets like family trees. But then there are other markings, scratches on stone, symbols on tablets, lines on metal, that refuse to settle into the known catalogues. They become unknown scripts. The claim around these artifacts is often dramatic, that the writing is not human, or not from any civilization we recognize, that it represents contact, a transmission, a fragment of communication that doesn't belong in the timeline. People say the symbols feel too precise, too alien, too unlike the messy drift of human language. Yet the honest truth is both simpler and, in a way, more profound. The world is full of human languages we can't read, lost scripts, untranslated systems, communities erased by conquest, disaster, or assimilation, writing traditions that existed briefly and then vanished, leaving only scattered artifacts like bones. In that sense, an unreadable inscription is not necessarily extraterrestrial. It may be a reminder of how much human history has been swallowed. Still, there are cases that linger in popular imagination. Tablets said to contain symbols that match no known language, artifacts with repeating patterns that feel intentional rather than decorative, inscriptions discovered without clear context, brought into the world through collectors, wars, or private digs where documentation is thin. And that's where the real problem begins. Without context, writing becomes a Rorschach test. People see what they want to see. A spiral becomes a star map. A triangle becomes a spacecraft. A line becomes a code. The mind is generous with meaning, especially when the origin story is fuzzy. But let's imagine for a moment that a genuinely unknown script exists, one with solid provenance, with consistent internal structure, repeated across multiple objects found in controlled excavations. What would it mean? First, it would mean we are missing a chapter. Not a cosmic chapter, necessarily, a human one. It would mean a culture wrote, communicated, and thought in ways that didn't survive into the languages we currently know. It would mean our map of literacy and civilization would need revision. Not because the past becomes magical, but because it becomes more crowded. Second, it would raise the question of how knowledge travels. Scripts don't appear from nothing. They evolve, they borrow, they mutate, they carry influences like genetic traces. If a script truly doesn't fit, that itself becomes data, suggesting isolation, innovation, or an origin point we haven't located. Third, it would expose our vulnerability as interpreters. We like to believe that with enough effort, we can decode anything. But decoding requires anchors, bilingual texts, known names, shared symbols. Without those, even brilliant minds can stall. The artifact becomes a locked door. This is why mysterious writing holds power. It is the perfect metaphor for the limits of understanding. A message exists, but meaning remains out of reach. That tension is almost unbearable to the human mind. We are meaning-making creatures. We would rather invent an answer than sit with silence. And so, unknown scripts attract storytellers. Some are sincere, some are opportunists, some are both at once. A symbol set becomes a prophecy. A tablet becomes a star chart. A set of marks becomes proof that they were here before we were ready. But we must ask, is it respectful to the past to fill it with our fantasies? If an inscription is truly human and truly lost, then turning it into an alien code might be another way of erasing the people who made it, by refusing them the dignity of being part of our shared human lineage. At the same time, we shouldn't dismiss the emotional pull. When you face unreadable marks, you feel the same strange loneliness you feel when you hear a language you don't understand at a train station. You realize how small your own comprehension is. You realize how much the world can contain without your permission. That is the human heart of this chapter, humility. So here's the open question that closes our 9th part. When we can't read the message, what is our responsibility? To keep trying patiently, to admit what we don't know, or to choose the comfort of a story that makes the mystery feel solved? Next, we enter the final stretch of our journey, where the artifacts become less about time and more about identity. Claims of bodies, remains, or biological evidence that challenge what it means to be human, and how quickly that challenge can turn wonder into fear. What if the most dangerous artifact isn't metal or stone, but bone? There's a special kind of unease that comes from looking at remains. Not because the past is frightening, but because it is intimate. A tool can be studied with distance. A carving can be admired, but a body, any body, forces a different kind of attention. It reminds us that history was once warm. This is where some of the most volatile claims gather. Stories of unusual skeletons, skulls with strange proportions, tiny bodies recovered from remote places, mummified forms that don't match expectations. The internet loves these stories because they sit at the intersection of science and shock. They invite the most dramatic question a person can ask. Is this human? Sometimes the answer is plainly yes, and the mystery is a distortion. Bad measurements, staged photos, misunderstood anatomy. Sometimes the answer is yes in a more complicated way. The remains are human, but affected by congenital conditions, illness, or cultural practices that alter shape. And sometimes the answer is still yes, but the context is heartbreaking. Children, premature births, communities with limited medical care, individuals who became curiosities rather than people. That's the first ethical line we have to draw. No artifact is worth stripping a human being of dignity. Still, the claims persist because a few cases are genuinely strange at first glance. A skull that seems elongated beyond what you expect. A tiny torso with proportions that don't look like the textbook diagrams. Bones that appear fused or deformed. It's easy, from a distance, to imagine non-human origins. It's harder, but more honest, to remember how many ways a human body can vary, and how much our expectations are shaped by a narrow sample of normal. There is also a long, complicated history here. Humans have altered bodies intentionally for thousands of years. Cranial shaping, dental modifications, binding practices, ritual scarification. In some cultures, an elongated head was not an anomaly, but an ideal, an identity. When we encounter those remains without understanding the tradition, we mistake culture for biology. And then there are the natural variations, genetic disorders that affect bone growth, forms of dwarfism, metabolic conditions, developmental anomalies. Medicine can explain many of them today, but explanation doesn't always arrive with gentleness. It can feel cold. It can feel like it drains the wonder. But wonder doesn't have to depend on aliens. Wonder can live in the complexity of life itself. So why do non-human remains stories feel so compelling? Because they threaten the boundary we rely on to feel stable, the boundary between us and everything else. If that boundary is porous, if there are other intelligences, other lineages, other kinds of beings, then the universe becomes larger and our identity becomes less solitary. That's a beautiful thought in one mood and a terrifying one in another. People swing between awe and fear without noticing the swing. They become protective. They become certain. They start looking for enemies or saviors. And that's where this topic becomes dangerous, because it's easy for curiosity to turn into dehumanization, and easy for ambiguity to be used as a weapon. The scientific approach, at its best, is slower. It asks for chain of custody. It asks for imaging, DNA, comparative anatomy, peer review. It asks for the boring details that prevent us from turning a person into a legend. It insists that extraordinary claims require extraordinary care. And yet, even with careful science, something remains emotionally unresolved. Because what people are really asking when they chase these stories is not only, what is this body? They are asking, are we alone in the category we call human? There may be no artifact on Earth that can answer that question cleanly. A bone can tell you about a life. It can tell you about health, age, injury, sometimes ancestry. It can tell you, with luck and context, what a community valued and how it treated its dead. But it cannot easily carry the cosmic meaning we want to load onto it. Which brings us to the reflection that matters most. When faced with remains that feel mysterious, Can we hold two truths at once? That the unknown deserves investigation and that the dead deserve respect? Next, we move away from bodies and back toward materials, but with a sharper lens. Claims of objects whose composition doesn't fit, alloys that read like riddles, and lab reports that whisper quietly that something in the sample doesn't belong. What if the most persuasive mystery doesn't come wrapped in folklore, but in numbers? Not campfire stories, not blurry photographs, not whispered testimonies, just a lab bench, a set of instruments, and a report that reads like plain weather. Percentages, isotopes, impurities, ratios, the kind of language that doesn't care what you want to believe. Because when people talk about forbidden artifacts, they often circle back to one specific kind of claim, a material sample whose composition seems wrong for its alleged origin, a fragment of metal retrieved from an unusual context, a piece of alloy said to have been recovered from a crash, a dig, a restricted site, a private collection that swears it has documentation. And then the promise, that analysis reveals something not possible, an isotopic signature that doesn't match Earth norms, or a purity profile that would be difficult to achieve with the technology of the era, or a layered structure so complex it resembles engineered composites more than accidental metallurgy. These are the claims that make people sit up straighter, because chemistry feels harder to fake than a story. And yet, this is where the quiet sophistication of doubt matters most. Because materials science is powerful, but it is also vulnerable to context. A sample without chain of custody is like a sentence ripped from a book, intriguing but untrustworthy. Contamination happens, mislabeling happens, human hands touch everything, and the world itself is full of strange materials that look impossible until you learn the right corner of geology or industrial history. Still, the core question remains worth holding. Could there be artifacts whose material properties suggest an origin outside our known historical pathways? If we set aside the word alien for a moment, we can phrase it differently. Could there be technological leaps that appeared earlier, in smaller pockets, and left only scattered traces? Could there be prototypes, experiments, or specialized crafts that never scaled into widespread industry, and thus never became part of the story we tell about progress? History tends to remember what becomes common. It forgets what stays rare. A singular object, an unusual alloy, a composite structure could be the work of a genius whose workshop burned down, whose apprentices died, whose notes were lost. Or it could be the work of a modern hoaxer with access to industrial materials and a talent for narrative. Or it could be a piece of something perfectly ordinary that has been framed as extraordinary by the way it was presented. And then there is the possibility that makes everyone uncomfortable for a different reason, that governments and corporations really do classify unusual materials, not because they are cosmic, but because they might offer strategic advantage. In that world, secrecy isn't a shadowy myth. It's standard operating procedure. The forbidden is not supernatural. It's bureaucratic. So you have a triangle of interpretation. At one corner, genuine anomaly. At another, misunderstood material. At the third, deliberate deception. The truth might sit on any edge, and without transparent data, it's impossible to place it cleanly. But let's stay with the feeling for a moment, because feelings are part of why this topic endures. There is something profoundly modern about wanting the lab to deliver certainty. We want the universe to sign its name in a way we can verify. We want proof that does not rely on belief. We want a sample that says, in clean math, you were not imagining it. The tragedy is that the lab can't do that alone. Science is not a single test. It is a culture. It is replication. It is peer scrutiny. It is the slow building of consensus through shared access. A secret analysis, even an accurate one, can't do the social work that turns data into knowledge. And that social work is precisely what secrecy disrupts. If a sample is real but locked away, it becomes a legend. If a sample is fake but promoted, it becomes propaganda. Either way, the public is left with a feeling rather than a conclusion that truth exists somewhere behind a door they cannot open. So here is the reflection that closes this chapter. What if the most haunting part of exotic materials claims isn't the possibility of other worlds, but the reminder that knowledge is not only about facts, it's about access? Next, we follow the trail of access itself, the stories of archives, classified collections, private rooms in museums, and the quiet machinery by which certain artifacts become visible to the world, and others do not. What if the real forbidden artifact is not an object, but a decision, a choice made in an office, at a committee table, in a museum back room, a choice about what gets displayed, what gets stored, what gets published, what gets lost, what gets relabeled, what gets quietly moved to a shelf, where no one asks questions. We imagine suppression as a dramatic act. Men in dark suits, files stamped in red, threats spoken in low voices. But more often, suppression looks like paperwork, like budget constraints, like academic incentives, like professional risk. Because institutions don't have to be evil to be cautious. They only have to be human. A museum curator has finite space. A university department has finite funding. A journal editor has finite patience for speculative claims. And every professional lives inside a network of reputation. To champion an anomaly is to risk being associated with the wrong kind of attention. It's to invite ridicule. It's to potentially fracture a career that took decades to build. So the anomaly sits in a box, not because anyone is terrified of the truth, but because the cost of pursuing the truth feels too high. This is where the narrative of hidden artifacts becomes complicated. Sometimes things are hidden deliberately, but often they are hidden by inertia. Add to that the darker, more strategic form of secrecy, when artifacts or data intersect with national security, intellectual property, or commercial advantage. In that world, concealment isn't extraordinary. It's policy. A material sample with potential applications might be classified or patented. A discovery that threatens tourism narratives might be minimized. A find that destabilizes political identity might be reframed. Truth is not the only value. It competes with power, money, stability, pride. And so, in the ecosystem of knowledge, certain things become visible while others remain in the shadows. Not because they are cosmic secrets, but because they are socially inconvenient. This chapter is the hinge of the entire series, because it moves us from artifacts as things to artifacts as relationships. Who owns them? Who studies them? Who gets to touch them? Who gets to decide what they mean? Think of an object pulled from the earth. The moment it's discovered, it becomes contested territory. It is no longer only a relic, it is a resource. Nations claim it as heritage. Collectors claim it as property. Scholars claim it as evidence. Communities claim it as identity. And sometimes, agencies claim it as a strategic asset. In that struggle, the artifact's story can be rewritten without changing a single atom. A piece of pottery can be labeled decorative rather than symbolic. A mechanism can be called astronomical curiosity rather than technical achievement. A human remain can be framed as anomaly rather than person. A questionable inscription can be ignored rather than investigated. Over time, these small choices accumulate into what feels like a conspiracy, even if no single villain exists. The system itself becomes the suppressor. And then there is the role of the public. Because institutions are not only hiding things from us, sometimes we hide things from ourselves. We choose narratives that flatter our worldview. We prefer explanations that confirm our tribe. We reward certainty over nuance. We punish people who say, "I don't know yet." That is not just an institutional problem, it's a cultural problem. So when we ask, are artifacts being hidden? We should also ask, what kind of truth culture have we built? Do we have room for ambiguity? Do we allow researchers to say, "This doesn't fit," without demanding that they leap immediately to a sensational conclusion? The most ethical version of this story is not about heroes and villains. It is about fragility, the fragility of knowledge when it depends on money, politics, and human ego. The fragility of the past when it depends on our willingness to care. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: the past is not only lost in fires and floods, it is lost in file cabinets, in unread reports, in mislabeled drawers, in photographs never published, in artifacts stored so quietly that they might as well have never been found. So we end with this question. When the guardians of knowledge choose safety over uncertainty, are they protecting society, or are they shrinking the space where truth can breathe? Next, we return to the artifacts themselves, but now with a sharper awareness of how stories form. We revisit the not alone question not as a claim, but as a metaphor. What if the fear of being alone is the engine that drives these legends? And what if the real discovery is learning how to live honestly with mystery? What if the question, "Are we alone?" isn't really about the sky at all, but about us? After enough stories, metal that remembers, gears that model the heavens, crystal carved like a dare, jars that might hum with chemistry, stones fitted with devotion, objects claimed to hide in rock, desert drawings meant for altitude, scripts that refuse to speak, bodies that become battlegrounds, alloys that feel like riddles, you start to notice a pattern. Every artifact, real or rumored, becomes a stage for a deeper human tension. We want the universe to be meaningful. We want our lives, brief as they are, to sit inside a larger narrative. The idea that we are not alone offers comfort to some, terror to others, but almost always it offers significance. It suggests that the story doesn't end with our species, that we are part of a broader community of mind, and that longing can shape interpretation. When an object doesn't fit our expectations, we have choices. We can let it expand our view of human history. We can treat it as an invitation to more careful research, or we can lift it into myth, making it carry a cosmic message, because the cosmic message feels more satisfying than the slow work of uncertainty. None of this makes the longing foolish. It makes it human. Because being human includes a particular kind of loneliness, not just social loneliness, but existential loneliness. We know we will die. We know the universe is vast. We suspect, deep down, that we might not matter. And then, somewhere in a museum case or a desert plain, an anomaly appears, and it whispers, "Maybe you do matter. Maybe you are not the only voice in the dark." That whisper is powerful. It can open minds. It can also close them. The healthiest response to mystery is curiosity with humility. The unhealthiest response is certainty without evidence. And in the world of forbidden artifacts, Certainty is always available. There is always someone ready to claim the answer, ready to declare that it's all proof, ready to sell the story as final. But real discovery rarely feels final. It feels like more questions. So in this chapter, rather than adding another artifact to the pile, we pause and examine how meaning is manufactured, how communities form around mysteries, how narratives harden, how skepticism is sometimes used as a weapon, and belief is sometimes used as a shield. You can see it in the way people talk about authority. For some, institutions are guardians of truth. For others, they are gatekeepers of lies. Both views can contain fragments of reality. Institutions can protect knowledge, and they can also protect themselves. Individuals can be visionary, and they can also be mistaken. The world is not clean. And then there is the role of media, how a story becomes a headline, how nuance is squeezed into a few sentences, how the most uncertain cases get the most attention because uncertainty is emotionally sticky. A blurry image travels farther than a careful paper. A dramatic claim spreads faster than a measured conclusion. This doesn't mean the mysteries are worthless. It means we must become better listeners, better at asking what we actually know, better at distinguishing possibility from probability, better at honoring the people behind the objects, ancient craftspeople, modern researchers, communities whose heritage gets turned into entertainment. Because the moment we treat artifacts only as proof, we stop seeing them as human traces. We stop seeing the labor, the belief, the skill, the pain, the hope. We turn the past into a prop. And perhaps that is the true danger of the not alone obsession. It can tempt us to abandon the richness of human history in favor of a simpler, more thrilling story. It can make us forget that even without visitors from the stars, the human story is already astonishing, full of invention, collapse, reinvention, and wonder. So here is the reflection to carry into the finale. What if the most important outcome of exploring these artifacts is not reaching a single conclusion, but learning how to live with mystery without becoming captive to it? Because mystery, handled well, doesn't shrink us. It enlarges us. It teaches patience. It teaches reverence for evidence. It teaches empathy for those who came before. In the final chapter, we gather the threads, not to declare a verdict, but to return to the opening question with clearer eyes. When the past refuses to behave, what kind of future do we build? One that welcomes complexity, or one that demands comforting myths? What if the real revelation isn't hidden in the artifacts, but in the way we change when we hold them? We began with a drawer, a case, a shelf. Somewhere, an object sits and quietly reshapes the atmosphere of a room. Not because it shouts the truth, but because it refuses to fit. Over 14 chapters, we walked through that refusal. We held it up to the light. We let it cast shadows. We tried to keep our hands steady, and what we found again and again was not a clean answer. We found a landscape. Some anomalies can be explained. Some likely can't, at least not yet. Some are human brilliance underestimated. Some are human desire overinflated. Some are honest puzzles. Some are mistakes. Some are stories built on thin evidence that nonetheless reveal thick emotional needs. The universe, it seems, does not owe us closure. But we do owe ourselves integrity. If you revisit each case with a calm mind, a pattern becomes clear. The strongest mysteries are the ones that teach humility. The ancient mechanism pulled from the sea reminds us that our ancestors were not simple. The precision stonework reminds us that skill can be extraordinary without being supernatural. The desert drawings remind us that imagination can build for viewpoints we cannot physically occupy. Even the contested claims, exotic materials, unreadable scripts, out-of-place objects remind us how careful we must be with evidence, how easily we can be seduced by what we want to be true. And then there is the theme that sits beneath all of it like bedrock: trust. Trust between the public and institutions. Trust between belief and skepticism. Trust between the storyteller and the listener. When trust erodes, mysteries metastasize. Every gap becomes a conspiracy. Every correction becomes proof of deception. Every unanswered question becomes a weapon. But when trust is nurtured through transparency, rigor, humility, the same mysteries become invitations rather than threats. They become reasons to learn, to research, to expand our maps. This is the humanistic insight at the heart of the journey. The unknown is not our enemy. The unknown is our home. We evolved inside it. We built language, science, and art as ways of negotiating it. We are not damaged by mystery. We are damaged by pretending mystery doesn't exist. So what about the question we started with? The question that pulls so many people into these stories. Are we alone? The honest answer is that no artifact in this series provides a definitive, universally accepted proof. Some cases point toward misinterpretation. Some point toward remarkable human ingenuity. Some remain unresolved due to incomplete data. And if there is evidence that would change everything, it has not entered the world in a way that meets the standards of open verification. That may disappoint those who came hoping for a final reveal. But there is another way to hold the question. Maybe not alone does not only mean other beings in the cosmos. Maybe it also means we are not alone across time. The past is full of minds whose thoughts reached farther than their era could support. Craftspeople and mathematicians, dreamers and engineers, communities that mapped seasons, built monuments, and left marks on the earth large enough for the sky to read. When we encounter a so-called forbidden artifact, we are meeting those minds. Even when the artifact is misunderstood, it exposes something true. Our hunger to connect, our hunger to be part of a larger story. And perhaps that hunger is not a flaw. Perhaps it is a compass, if we don't let it become a cage, because the goal of inquiry is not to replace one certainty with another. The goal is to keep widening the circle of what we can hold: wonder and doubt, hope and rigor, imagination and restraint. So here is the closing question, a timeless one that doesn't need a verdict to be meaningful. When you stand before an object that doesn't fit, when history misbehaves, when evidence is incomplete, when mystery whispers at the edge of your understanding, what kind of person do you choose to become? Do you become a collector of comforting stories? Or do you become a patient witness, curious, humble, and brave enough to let the unknown remain unknown until it earns a name? The future of truth may depend less on what we find and more on how we learn to look.